Welcome to Let's Talk About Mental Health, the show full of simple ideas for better mental health. On this week's show...
Cut! There's something wrong?
Look, love your work, love your energy, but this isn't your podcast, kiddo. You're on TV now.
Well, let's not get carried away. It's YouTube, so you can probably calm down a bit.
Potato, whatever. Aren't you the one who called this thing Let's Talk About Mental Health TV?
Why, yes. Yes, I did.
Well then, let's do this. Lights, camera, action!
Welcome to the very first episode of Let's Talk About Mental Health TV. I'm your host, Jeremy Godwin, and each week I'll be sharing lots of simple ideas for better mental health and well-being, as well as giving you different things to think about in terms of what really constitutes well-being. So, without any further ado, let's talk. How was that?
Meh. It's not going to win an Emmy or anything, but it'll do. This is Let's Talk About Mental Health TV, a weekly show full of simple ideas for better mental health. I'm your host, Jeremy Godwin, and each week we'll be having some big conversations about mental health. Plus, I'll be sharing lots of ways that you can improve and maintain your overall well-being. So, let's talk about mental health. Because the more we talk about it, the easier it gets.
Hello and welcome. I'm very excited to be talking to you on YouTube this week. I've been wanting to launch a YouTube show on top of the weekly podcast that I already do for quite a while now, but I kept on putting it off. To be blunt, 2020 was a really tough year for me, as I'm sure it was for many of you, thanks to COVID and everything else. And I spent a lot of the year dealing with issues like grief, worry, and stress. And quite frankly, they sent me running to the nearest cheeseburger because I'm an emotional eater. So, as you can see, I've clearly been pretty emotional for the last few decades. Anyway, so even though I wasn't 100% sure whether or not I'd fit into the camera, carrying around extra weight or not being entirely perfect is never an excuse for holding us back from pursuing the things that we feel passionate about. And if you've ever listened to me on my podcast, which, by the way, now has listeners in over 110 countries in the world, then you'll know from my podcast how passionate I am about helping people to find simple ideas for better mental health. And so that's what this show is all about. So this week I'll be talking about a few things, including what this show is all about and who I am, in case you're new here. I'll be talking about the topic of the week, which this week is Let's Talk About 2021, because we really need to talk about it. I'll be sharing 5 big lessons from 2020 and what they mean for us in 2021. And I'll be talking about some recent stuff related to mental health, including what's on the podcast this week and why I chose that topic. And then I'll finish up with one last tip for good mental health. So, what is this show all about? Well, Let's Talk About Mental Health TV is a program about simple ideas for better mental health. Now, while we don't all experience mental illness, although between 20 and 25% of us will do so in any given year, and nearly half of us will experience a mental illness at some point in our lives, the thing that everybody on this planet has in common is that we all have mental health. And just like when it comes to good physical health, looking after your mental health takes regular effort. And that's where this show comes in. So each week I'll be sharing different things that you can do to improve and maintain good mental health. And I'll be challenging you to think about what's working well for you, as well as what isn't working well, so that you can do something about it. Now, if you are experiencing a mental health condition like anxiety or depression, etc., this show is not meant to replace professional treatment like therapy or medication, but instead to complement it, because there are always things that you can do yourself to help improve your mental health. But it is important to make sure that you work with a licensed therapist or work with your doctor if you are experiencing symptoms of issues like anxiety and depression. And then the other thing that I want you to know up front about the show is that it's called Let's Talk About Mental Health for 2 reasons. The first is because we definitely need to talk about this stuff more. And the more we talk about it, the easier it gets. But the second reason is that it's not just about talking about mental health with other people. The most important conversation that you can have is an honest conversation with yourself. A conversation where you are completely truthful and where you take the time to understand where you are in terms of your life and in terms of your mental health and well-being, so that you then know what needs your attention. And that's an ongoing conversation, and it's one that this show will be helping you to have every single week. So if we haven't met before through my podcast, then you might be wondering, who am I? Well, I'm an Australian writer and speaker who used to work in the corporate sector, and for a long time I thought that I was on the right track in terms of not just my career but also my life in general, until November 2011 when I had a total breakdown. That was then followed by several years of crippling depression and anxiety, and in fact throughout most of 2012 and 2013 I was suicidal. Now, as I began to slowly recover from the worst of my condition, I had to learn how to adapt to living with mental illness instead of fighting it. And that led me to change my career to focus on mental health. I wanted to be able to help other people, so I went back to university, completed a degree in sociology and psychology, and I'm currently training to become a registered counsellor. And then in October 2019, I launched Let's Talk About Mental Health, which is a podcast where each episode every week looks at one specific aspect of mental health, like overthinking, resilience, assertiveness, etc. And it provides you with practical advice and simple ideas for how to address that specific area of your mental health. So the whole podcast is designed to build over time and provide you with lots of different tools and techniques that may work for you so that you can find the tools, if you like, or the opportunities that are going to help you out that feel right for you, because we're all unique and we all have our own preferences. Now, the podcast has now grown to have listeners in over 110 countries worldwide. So now I'm adding this show on YouTube where I'll be talking about mental health more generally. I'll still be doing the podcast each week where I'll focus on one specific topic. So what can you expect from me and what can you expect from this show? Well, in my podcast and in this show, I tell it like it is. There's no sugarcoating and I'm completely upfront about the good, the bad, and the ugly of mental health. And more importantly, I don't just share my opinions. Everything I talk about in my work is grounded in quality research, and I also share the sources that I use. And I do that because I don't want you just to take my word as the gospel. Instead, I want to encourage you to take a look at things with a critical eye and to make rational decisions that are grounded in fact. And beyond all of that, I hope that as you get to know me better, you'll realize that I do this stuff because it comes from a real passion for what I do and from wanting to help people to be the best version of themselves possible. I've lived through debilitating mental illness and I've come out the other side. I still live with mild anxiety today, and it definitely takes work to keep it under control, but I'm nowhere near where I was 5 or 10 years ago. And so what I can tell you is that even though we all experience mental health differently, because each one of us is unique and so are our life experiences, it is absolutely possible to take control of your mental health and well-being so that you can live a life that feels fulfilling and satisfying. So what can you expect from this program each week? Well, look, I tried really hard to come up with a set structure for this thing each week, but then I just got distracted binge watching Kelly Stamp's videos on YouTube because, well, she makes me laugh and I'm obsessed with her spatula. So I decided to take a page out of Kelly's book and I'm just going to talk about whatever I find interesting about mental health and well-being. And if other people like you find that interesting, then hooray! I think that like most things in life, if you just be yourself, then you'll eventually find people who enjoy what you do. So if this show is for you, then hi and welcome. Now, since it's the first episode, this is a lot more about me and what I do than I was originally planning on covering, but I thought that I'd have a bit of a chat about mental health and sort of, what's happening this season on Earth 2021, 2020, the sequel. And then we'll get into a bit of a chat about some stuff that I found interesting recently related to mental health and well-being. So, let's talk about 2021.
As we head further into 2021, and hopefully find that we begin to see a reduction in cases of COVID-19 around the world, however long that may take, it's time to ask yourself what you want your world to look like today and tomorrow. We need to be mindful that in our rush to return to normal, The risk is that we could lose the valuable lessons of 2020 if we don't take the time to pause and reflect on what we've learned and what that means for us, both now and in the future. The fact is that we cannot stop time and we cannot go backwards because life just does not work like that. You can fight it as much as you want, but regardless, time carries on and the world keeps on turning. You can only move forward in life. And you certainly cannot just erase or unlearn everything that you've experienced over the past year. No matter where you are in the world, we will be forever changed by all of this. And that's okay. Life is change. The choice we each have to make every day is whether or not we use that change to help us to grow. Choosing to grow is about choosing to be the best version of yourself possible. About taking all of life's lessons, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and using them to find ways to be better and do better every day. Rather than resisting, we can choose to let the events of the past year change us for the better in 2021 to help us grow. The bad news is that things won't ever go back to the way they were, but the good news is that things won't ever go back to the way they were. This is an opportunity to change our world and change ourselves for the better. And if you think the old ways were great and don't need to be changed, you're wrong. The past was far from perfect, and there are much better ways to do things so that we all have the greatest chance of living the best life possible. Not just if you have money or if you live in a specific part of the world. So, what choices will you make this year? The biggest decision that we each need to make is whether or not you'll use what you've learned so far to help you become the very best version of yourself possible, today and every day. Let's start with ourselves and the steps that we each choose to take every day. So, what have you learned? What isn't working in your life? How will you change? What do you want more of? What do you want less of? What do you want to do differently? What dreams will you pursue? And most importantly, what will you do now and throughout the year and beyond to be the best version of yourself possible? Here's the main point of all of this. You can be, do, and have anything you want. And the thing is that all is possible. And at the same time, everything changes. That can be tough, such as when we lose those that we love or we're facing difficult times. But good can come from any situation, even out of the darkest of times. It just requires you to put one foot in front of the other and to focus on growth and to focus on being the best version of yourself possible. The choice is always yours. In the podcast each week, I share a quote related to the topic that I'm covering and I ask you to reflect on it for a few minutes and consider what it means to you. And I'm going to do the same thing now before I move on to the rest of this episode. This quote is by Nido Qubein, and it is: "It's not your circumstances that define your future, it's your choices. What you choose is what you get."
I know, I Spielberged the shit out of that, right? Now look, don't be expecting cinematic production values every single week. I did get a little bit carried away over my holidays getting ready for that. But look, with all of that stuff in mind, and I really do encourage you to reflect on those questions that I posed towards the end of the video, which you can find in the description box down below. Hopefully most of us have learned a few big lessons from all of the events of 2020. And hopefully they can help us to improve when it comes to our mental health and well-being in 2021. So here are my 5 big lessons from 2020 and what they mean for us this year in 2021. And lesson number 1 is, you can make all the plans in the world and then shit happens. And that's okay. In 2020, we learned that even when everything goes to crap and it seems like a total dumpster fire, we find a way to adapt. And we'll need to keep on adapting throughout 2021 because this is not just going to magically change overnight. And by accepting that and letting go of our need for control over everything, then we can actually begin to take steps in the direction that we want to go. Which brings me to my second point. Control is an illusion. All that we can actually control is ourselves. All that we have any direct control over is what we do, say, and feel. And when shitty feelings come out of nowhere, we can at least control what we choose to do with those feelings. And 2020 decided to force us to learn that fact whether we liked it or not. So in 2021, let's get better at letting go of the delusion that we have any control over external events, because we don't. And instead, let's learn how to respond thoughtfully to things that happen with grace, dignity, and a kick-ass attitude that says, even if I'm up shit creek without a paddle, I get to choose what I do next, and I get to choose how I respond. Because my next point is that you can and will and did survive anything. Now, even if at first you might be petrified, it's not the end of the world, and you will adapt. Be kind and patient with yourself. And remember that all things take time, effort, and perseverance. And probably the biggest way that you can do that is my next point, which is to get your priorities right. What matters most in life is really free. It's those that we care about the most. And hopefully 2020 taught us to connect as much as possible with the people and pets who we love with all of our hearts. So if that's the case, shouldn't we be making our relationships with our loved ones, like our family and friends, and our partners if you're attached, shouldn't we be making those things our number one priority in 2021? Invest time and energy in your relationships and treat them like gold, because they really are priceless. And treat yourself like gold as well, because my final point is that self-care isn't selfish, it's basic survival. Did anybody else find in the early days of the Rona roller coaster that they were just overwhelmed by anxiety at least 81 times a day? Or was it just me? I mean, I found that making plenty of time for self-care and also consciously being gentle with myself made a huge difference when I was struggling with everything that was going on. And it helped me to get through each day. And that's something that we all need to do more of today and in the future. And you don't need to spend any money to do that either. Slow down, embrace simplicity, and be kind to yourself this year. Because if you can't be kind to yourself, how the hell are you going to be kind to anybody else? So, what did 2020 teach you? What will you do in 2021 to apply what you've learned? Let me know in the comments down below. And now, let's talk about some recent stuff related to mental health. This week, I want to share an article in the New York Times that was posted in early December 2020, all about mental health startups and teletherapy. Throughout 2020, I've had quite a few people reach out to me who listen to my podcast and ask me for some advice because they haven't been able to go out and physically see a mental health professional or have found it really challenging to find someone that they feel comfortable with. Now, I live in a small town in regional Australia. I'm originally from Sydney. We then moved to Melbourne, where we lived for 14 years, and then we moved here a few years ago. So I know all too well how hard it can be to find someone to work with when you leave the cities and just how different the service levels can be in a smaller location or when you can't find someone, particularly if you don't connect with the person that you're supposed to be working with. And thanks to the COVID-19 pandemic, the same problem has affected many more people, regardless of whether they live in the city or the country. Now, this New York Times article was quite interesting because it talks about the momentum that's building up around the mental health startup space, as well as providers moving to offering more online servicing and even going to online servicing model completely by using, video conferencing tools like Zoom and Google Teams, etc., which is in fact how I now do business as a coach and counselor. All of my client meetings are now 100% online, and I have no intention whatsoever to go back to face-to-face servicing. And the thing is that for me, it allows me to connect with people regardless of their location, and I can sit here in my office, in my home, and work. So I'm sharing this article this week, which you'll find in the link in the description box below, because I just cannot emphasize enough how important it is to work with a qualified professional, whether that's a therapist or a counselor. in order to manage any challenges that you might be facing. A professional can guide you and help you to see things that you might not consider, just like a good personal trainer does at the gym. Further to that, working with a professional is also a great form of preventative maintenance for your mental health. So just like you hopefully exercise on a regular basis to look after your physical health, talking to somebody objective about your feelings and emotions can help you to work through them and to address issues before they become major problems. The challenge is finding someone who you feel comfortable with, because if you're doing it right and being totally raw and honest and vulnerable with the person that you've chosen to speak with, then you're going to need someone who you feel comfortable with. And because of that, I think that the move towards more remote therapy and counselling is one of the best things to come out of the dumpster fire that was 2020. Because now you can shop around and find someone that you connect with before you fully commit. And it doesn't matter if you're in Tennessee or Timbuktu. So a huge shout out to the New York Times for another insightful article and for shining a light on an emerging aspect of mental health care that I think is going to make a positive difference and is going to change things a lot this decade. There are lots of different ways that you can help yourself as well. And speaking of ways to help yourself and get support, that's what I do on my podcast each week. It's like having a counsellor or a therapist or a self-help book in your pocket or wherever you keep your device. So, what's on the podcast this week? Well, this week I'm looking at self-awareness. This episode is all about getting to know yourself and developing your self-awareness, because understanding who you are and how that influences every aspect of your life, including your feelings and your overall health, is a massive part of well-being. Now, I chose to talk about self-awareness because this is the third episode of 2021, and my focus on the podcast this year is the year of well-being, because well-being doesn't just happen, it takes work. So each week on the podcast this year, I'll be focusing on things that will improve your overall well-being. 2 weeks ago in episode 60, I talked about well-being, and last week in episode 61, I looked at happiness. So if you haven't already, head over to letstalkaboutmentalhealth.com.au/episodes to listen to those episodes now, or you can read the full transcript for free. Plus, if you sign up to my free mailing list, you'll also receive new episodes directly in your inbox every single week. You can also find the show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and wherever else fine podcasts are found. But also, there's an audio-only version here on YouTube. And now it's time for one final tip for better mental health and well-being. And this week's tip is all about the news, which, I don't know, is it just me or is a big chunk of the news these days looking more and more like a statue covered in pigeon shit? Just remember that you can choose what you consume and what you don't. And when it comes to the news, you need to take a step back if you want to protect your mental health and well-being, because that shit will make your head explode. So limit your news intake to just once a day and mentally dip your toe in the water by just grabbing the headlines so that you're up to date, and then you can get on with your life. Look, there's so much wild stuff going on in the world at the moment, and if you fall down the rabbit hole of watching the news channels or constantly checking news online, you may very likely find yourself wanting to build a bunker and hide out for the next 5 years. So instead of doing that, just remember, be kind to yourself, and nobody needs to watch or read the news non-stop. And please, for the love of puppies, don't be one of those people who then goes and shares all the bad news articles on their social media, you know, like your Aunt Susan on Facebook, who shares every bit of bad news she comes across. Don't be that person. Thank you. So that's nearly it for this week. Next week, I'll be covering some other stuff about mental health, well-being, and the world around us. And I may or may not be finding new and inventive ways to work Spice Girls lyrics into everything that I say. And if you don't believe that it's possible that I would try to do that, just check out episode 62 of the podcast where I went to town. Anyway, you can find more content at letstalkaboutmentalhealth.com.au, where you can listen to past episodes of the podcast and read full transcripts. And you can also find Let's Talk About Mental Health on Instagram, Facebook, and Pinterest at LTA Mental Health. Find the podcast each week wherever you get your podcasts, including Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and more. And the audio-only version of the podcast is also available here on YouTube. And while you're here, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Thanks so much for joining me this week, and I hope to see you again next week. Look after yourself and make a conscious effort to share positivity and kindness out into the world, because you get back what you put out. Take care and talk to you next time.